Largely, I do believe, because I come from a behaviorist, law-based religion. We care how you act. That's why we don't have a claim that if you look at another woman with lust, it's as if you've committed adultery with her.
No, I think what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount was elevate the teaching of the rabbis. Elevate it. He went above them. He said, well, you've been told you shouldn't commit adultery. I'm telling you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart. He got to the heart of the law. They were content with the practical application of the law. He was not content with that.
There's only one way to commit adultery in Judaism, and it's with a different organ. And I'm not being cute. I'm being very realistic. Looking with lust is not a sin in Judaism.
This man didn't understand the depth of the law. If he understood the depth of the law, he would know that he had hatred, that lustful thoughts were a part of his life, that desiring to steal, covetousness, lies, dishonor to his parents were part of the fabric of his wretched heart. Truth of the matter is, he says, I've kept these since my youth up. In all honesty, he'd broken those that day. Because no sinner can live without impure thoughts.
Hello, welcome back to another video of Verse Revelations. This video is a conversation between Jordan Peterson and many known Bible scholars, where they touched on different topics, and one of them being the difference between lust and adultery as it relates to Judaism and Christianity. So we have Dennis Prager, who is Jewish, Jonathan Peugeot, James Orr, and others at the same table, and you'll be surprised by what Dennis Prager said about lust. Then the other half of the video, we have John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul giving biblical clarity on the subject of lust and adultery in relation to the law. So let's dive right into this conversation.
Largely, I do believe, because I come from a behaviorist, law-based religion. We care how you act. That's why we don't have a claim that if you look at another woman with lust, it's as if you've committed adultery with her. I am, as I said yesterday, I thank God for America's Christians. And Maimonides said if it weren't for Christians, the world wouldn't know about the Torah. So I'm a big Christian fan. But obviously Christianity and Judaism are not identical religions. And we have no equivalent that if you look upon another woman with lust, it's as if you have committed adultery with your heart. There's only one way to commit adultery in Judaism, and it's with a different organ. And I'm not being cute. I'm being very realistic. Looking with lust is not a sin in Judaism.
What's the stance on pornography?
So pornography, when I'm asked this question...
Just to put you on the spot,
You
by the
did
way.
indeed. Okay, so my answer, when it's raised on my radio show, I have a male-female hour, and I'm very open about sexual subjects. I always ask if a wife calls me and says, my husband looks at pornography, I found on his computer, I have one question. How is your life of intimacy with your husband? Is it good? In other words, is the pornography in lieu of you or in addition to you? Mm-hmm. And I know this is not a religious answer, mm-hmm. and I'm not even giving a religious answer. I'm giving mm-hmm. what I think is a moral and realistic answer. Men want variety. And if adultery is a substitute for, if pornography is a substitute for one's wife, it's awful. If it's a substitute for adultery, it's not awful. That is my unpredictable answer.
Well, there is a clinical rule of thumb that's akin to that, I would say. If you're trying to decide clinically whether someone's partaking in a habit, say use of alcohol, has reached the threshold of clinical significance, one of the things you do is ask the person you're assessing, now, is it interfering with your employment? Has it got you in trouble with the law? Is your family complaining? Does it stop you from doing other things that you should be doing? And so the judgment isn't the use of the forbidden substance itself. It is in some sense consequentialist. And I'm not saying that that's an absolute, but it is a hallmark of clinical judgment.
But Dennis, you're making, I think, too big a gap between, behavior and where it comes from. And surely the 10th commandment is exactly that. You could expound everything Jesus said from thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, or another woman you're not whatever.
Well,
No, the whole point
okay.
of coveting, it begins in the heart. And I understand your Hebrew word for covet. It's a desire that doesn't stop halfway.
Right, to take.
It takes action.
It's to take.
Yeah.
It's not. There's no ban in the 613 laws of the Torah on lusting. I don't even know there's a tava is the closest you could get to lust in Hebrew, but yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you about that.
The covet is critical. I can be attracted to my neighbor's wife. I can't want her. There's a difference because but what about a single woman? I asked one of the great Protestant thinkers of our generation in a public debate in Phoenix. I asked them, so can a single Christian male look upon a single woman with lust? He can't be committing adultery. He's not married and she's not married. So is the real ban lust or is the ban on adultery?
Yeah. I mean, at least for me, when I hear all of this from my own Orthodox perspective, it's bewildering because at least from the tradition in which I am, it's not a morality question. Even the word morality, it bothers me. At least in the Christian tradition that I participate in, the call is to be transformed. The call is to be free. That's the call. Christ is calling us to be free. And so the idea of like, can you lust or can't you lust or can you do this or not this? The answer is we have desires in us, and these desires tend to enslave us. They tend to pull us into themselves. And these laws are exterior ways for you to understand how it is that you can now be free from these desires. None of the desires are wrong. Like sexual desire isn't wrong, desire to eat isn't wrong, none of these things are wrong. The problem is when they capture you.
The subordination.
Right, and so it's not about like trying to figure out if I'm sinning or not sinning. Like if I go to confession, I ask forgiveness for all the sins I've done, voluntary and involuntary. It's like I'm sinning all the time. If you want to know, like every all day long I'm sinning. But
that's why you're so much fun.
That's why I'm so much fun. But the idea is rather that to attend to my desires in the sense so that I'm not captured by them, so that I don't become obsessed, so that I don't fall into that. So to me, like the question of like legally trying to figure out like where I'm sinning or where I'm not, it's just like it pulls me into a world
So if a man has, and I know this case, I know a man who was saintly in taking care of his Alzheimer's wife, who got Alzheimer's at the young age of 50, and watched over her and bathed her for a decade, and then. So I would just ask. You asked me about pornography. So this man was faithful to a wife with whom he could not have relations, obviously, for a decade or more. I think it went to 15 years. Would he have been wrong in relieving his sexual tension with a photograph?
See, I'm wondering if it's this, Dennis, maybe, and this is something that I had talked to people in my clinical practice about. So imagine there's and I guess we're into thou shalt not commit adultery, by the way, which is the next commandment. You can imagine an erotic image that compels sexual desire. And I think that's part of what we're discussing, the morality of that, or its potential to be an implement to the instantiation of an ideal. You can imagine a situation where your desire is to sleep with your neighbor's wife. You're not acting on it, but the reason you're not acting on it is because she doesn't want to sleep with you. Now, it still seems to me that given that your desire is to undertake the act, and the only reason that you're not able to manage it has nothing to do with your moral stance, it has to do with the impossibility of the action. Now, given it's, I don't know how you would deal with that, because
that's a violation of do not covet. He's coveting his neighbor's wife. It's clear as a bell.
I think what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount was elevate the teaching of the rabbis. Elevate it. He went above them. He said, well, you've been told you shouldn't commit adultery. I'm telling you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery in your heart. He got to the heart of the law. They were content with the practical application of the law. He was not content with that. So I would say that Jesus was the purest Jew that ever lived. because he understood the elevation of the law to the heart and the soul. It would be
What Jesus is saying is that when God says, don't commit adultery, the full measure of that prohibition incorporates within it the whole complex of that sin. Not only the actual act, but all of the things that are a part of it, all the way from adultery back to the initial beginnings that cross this line of lust. And by the same token, when the law says, thou shalt not kill, we haven't kept the law if we've walked through this world and never murdered anybody. But Jesus is saying the broader implications of that prohibition, the broader implications of God's law, are that not only should we not kill, but that we should not harm. Not only should we not harm, but we should not injure mentally, psychologically, any other way. And not only that, there's a positive thing. There's a positive balance side, a positive righteousness. Not only should we not kill, but we should promote life. There is a positive as well as a negative ramification of the law. And again, what Jesus was doing there was criticizing a simplistic understanding of the law, which is exactly what the Pharisees got into. And the rich young ruler, you remember he came and he asked Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus said, you know the law, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. And what does the young man say? All these things I have kept since my youth. Had he? Well, if you understand the law in the narrow sense of the most wicked expression of these sins, it's perfectly possible that that rich young man had never stolen a nickel, had never actually committed adultery, had never killed anybody. But what Jesus was trying to teach him was that he couldn't keep the Ten Commandments for 5 minutes in their broader amplifications. And that's the lesson he was trying to teach the Pharisees. He was never saying that it's as bad to lust as it is to commit adultery. But he's saying that if you lust, you have not fulfilled the whole measure of the complex of the law.
Here's the most damning delusion that any mind can ever believe. That I'm good. That's it. That I'm good. When you tell people they're wicked, evil, corrupt, and not good at all, they don't believe that. They didn't believe it then, they don't believe it today. People don't believe that. So they go to hell believing they're good. And until they believe they're not, there's no hope for them. Till you believe you're not, there's no hope for you. So let's find out whether this man is good. That's Jesus' agenda here. You're throwing the word good around. Let's find out about goodness. No one is good except God alone. I'll give you a test. You know the commandments. Matthew 19:17 says he added, and keep the commandments. You know them. You know you're to keep them. He gets that. Jesus gives him some examples. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. And all of those except one are taken directly out of the second table of the law. Exodus chapter 20, verses 12 to 16, the Ten Commandments. This is the second half of the Ten Commandments. So let's go back to the second table of the law. The first table deals with the relationship to God, the second with the relationships among people. So let's just go to the human relationship side, first of all, and see how well you're doing on that one. And his response, what is it? He said to him, Teacher, I've kept all these things from my youth up. Wow. That's why you're good. You're good because you've always kept that second table of the law. You know what that shows you? The man is living in a delusion, first of all. But more importantly, he understands the surface of the law, but not the depth of the law. Because the law goes much deeper than the surface. That's why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verses 20 to 48, can't go through all of that now, said this, you have heard it said, you've been taught, but I say to you, and he said it over and over and over and over, you've been taught that if you don't murder, you're fine. I'm telling you, if you hate someone, you're a murderer in your heart. You've been taught if you don't commit adultery, you're okay. But I'm telling you, if you look on a woman to lust after her in your heart, you've committed adultery. This man didn't understand the depth of the law. If he understood the depth of the law, he would know that he had hatred, that lustful thoughts were a part of his life, that desiring to steal, covetousness, lies, dishonor to his parents were part of the fabric of his wretched heart. Truth of the matter is, he says, I've kept these since my youth up. In all honesty, he'd broken those that day. Because no sinner can live without impure thoughts. He'd shattered that law that very day with his attitude toward others. He'd broken the law. He was a lawbreaker. And as a lawbreaker, he was worthy of death. And that's what the law's supposed to do. Kill you. Sentence you to death and divine judgment. You think you're fine because you've managed to control it on the surface? You're not. He didn't understand the depth of the law. And there was more. He not only was a violator of the second half, he was a flagrant violator of the first half. You say, what's the first half of the law? Well, you know what it is. You shall have no other gods before me, make no idols, don't take my name in vain, and remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. You would say, well, wait a minute. I mean, he was worshiping God. He probably certainly didn't take God's name in vain. He must have observed the Sabbath. And he certainly put God first in his life. Not really. He is a blasphemer. He has violated not only the second table of the law, but the first table of the law by being a blasphemer of God. And Jesus takes him now to the foundation of the law. And the foundation of the law is in Exodus 20, verse 3, and it says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall have no other gods before me. You don't worship anybody but me. God demands exclusive, comprehensive, total worship. Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. And if you do that, you won't have idols, right? And you won't take his name in vain. And you won't desecrate his day. It all flows out of the first. How bad was this man? How far from good was this man? He not only regularly broke the second table of the law in his heart, but he lived an entire life of blasphemy in which he worshiped another god. He shattered the first table of the law. Every time he worshiped, he violated the first table of the law. Every time the name of God slipped between his lips, it was taken in vain. And every time he went to a synagogue or the temple to observe a Sabbath, he was a blaspheming hypocrite. So how do you know all that? Because I can read my Bible, follow. Looking at him, verse 21, Jesus felt a love for him. Maybe a tear, like the tears he shed over Jerusalem, coursed down Jesus' cheeks. Tears of sympathy and compassion. So sad. Because this man was a blasphemer and didn't know it. This man was a violator and didn't know it. This man was the worst. Here comes the exposure. One thing you lack. Just one thing. Say, how can you say that? One thing. Go sell all you possess, give to the poor. You'll have treasure in heaven. That's what you said you wanted. Come follow me. How can it be that simple? But at these words he was saddened, and he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. You know why he is a blasphemer? Because he has another God. Who is his other God? He had much what? property. He had an idol. He didn't love the Lord his God with all his heart, soul, and mind. That's the one thing Jesus asked him to do. Let me just have you do one thing. Get rid of the idol, which is your money and your possession. You don't get saved by lowering your bank account. You get saved when you get rid of your idol and you embrace the true God. He's a blaspheming idolater. And again, I'll say it, every time he opened his mouth, he took the Lord's name in vain. Every time he showed up on a Sabbath, he violated that Sabbath as a hypocritical, idolatrous blasphemer. Earthly wealth, temporal satisfaction was his God. In fact, he was his own God. Jesus preached the law to him and he never got to the gospel. Because you can't get to the gospel, which is the good news, until someone accepts the bad news, the condemnation of the law. How do you tell a highly respected, revered, honored, religious man who sees his prosperity as the beneficence of a God who is pleased with him, who sees his position in the synagogue as evidence of his true spiritual virtue? How do you tell that man that good is not relative, it is absolute, and there's only one who's good, and that's God, and he is not? And then tell him, as a student of the law, that he is a regular violator of the whole law of God from the top to the bottom, who worships himself. And that's the way it is with all people who refuse the gospel, who never get to the gospel. That's why I say the gospel hangs in the shadows silently here. If the law doesn't drive you to Christ, it'll drive you to hell in your own spiritual pride. He's a blasphemer who has another God. If he would do one thing, it would be to get rid of the other God and love the Lord with all his heart, soul, and might. And the question is for you, what will you do?
All right, there's nothing much I can add to that. Well said. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and leave your comments below. See you in the next video. Godspeed.